The afternoon sun slanted across the porch of the small wooden house on the edge of Helena, painting long shadows through the railings. Benjamin Thorne sat in his rocking chair, 80 years pressing down on his shoulders like the weight of mountains. His hair had gone white as fresh snow, his back bent with decades of honest labor, but his eyes remained clear, sharp, seeing not just what was before him, but what had been. His grandson Thomas stood at the porch steps, 18 years old and tall military duffel bag at his feet. The boy was leaving in the morning. Korea had just signed its armistice, but young men were still being called to serve, still being asked to make hard choices far from home. Benjamin held an old photograph between weathered fingers. A young woman stared back at him from across 70 years. Dark hair, determined eyes standing before a mansion that no longer existed. "Before you go," Benjamin said, his voice, the low rumble of distant thunder, "I need to tell you about the woman who saved this family, and about how one lie led me to the greatest truth I ever knew." Thomas shifted his weight, glancing at the bag. He had heard stories before. His grandfather's tales of the old Montana territory, when the West was still being tamed and fortunes were being made in blood and dust. "Grandma Grace, you mean? You already told me. She was your mail-order bride." Benjamin shook his head slowly. "Not the story I told. This is the full truth. About how I deceived her. About murder. About a woman 10 times braver than I ever was." The boy's attention sharpened. He moved to the chair beside his grandfather, settling in as the sun continued its descent toward the distant peaks. 70 years ago, Montana was still frontier. Thorne Estate was the largest holding in this part of the territory. Now all that remains is this house. Benjamin gestured to the modest structure around them. Everything else was sold, given away. "You never knew why our family went from wealth to this." Thomas shook his head. "Then listen, because tomorrow you march off to war for your country. But first you need to understand there are battles more important than the ones fought with guns. Battles with the past, with conscience, with doing right when everyone around you chooses wrong." Benjamin closed his eyes. When he opened them again, his voice had changed. Younger, remembering. September 1884. I was 30 years old, and a woman named Grace Morgan stepped off a train in Helena believing she was coming to marry a poor farmer who needed help making ends meet. I had lied to her from the very first word. The old man's fingers tightened on the photograph. This is how it began, the arrival. The train's whistle screamed across the valley as it lurched to a stop at the Helena station. Grace Morgan pressed her hand against the window, feeling the glass vibrate with the dying momentum of 3,000 miles. 6 days she had traveled from Boston. 6 days watching the world transform outside her window as civilization thinned and scattered until there was nothing but grass and ski and the occasional lonely structure standing defiant against wind and time. She was 23 years old and everything she owned fit in the worn carpet bag at her feet. The conductor moved through the car, calling out Helena in a voice made harsh by years of coal smoke and mountain air. Grace smoothed down her traveling dress. Dark blue wool carefully mended in 3 places where the fabric had worn through. Her fingers found the small hat perched on her pinned hair, adjusting it by habit more than necessity. This was the moment, the single point upon which the rest of her life would turn. Other passengers pushed past, eager to disembark. A woman with 2 small children. A businessman in a dusty suit. A young man who had spent the entire journey reading the same newspaper until the pages grew soft as cloth. Grace stood on shaking legs. The carpet bag felt heavier than it should. Inside were 2 changes of clothes, her mother's Bible, a tortoiseshell comb, and the letters from Benjamin Thorne tied with string. Everything that remained of her old life could be carried in one hand. The platform struck her boots with solid finality. Montana air hit her lungs like a wall, thin, cold, carrying the scent of pine smoke and dust and something wild she had no name for. She scanned the crowd for a face that might match the brief description. Tall brown hair, will be wearing work clothes. The description fit half the men on the platform. Her hands tightened on the bag as panic began its slow crawl up her spine. What if he had not come? What if he had reconsidered? She had barely enough money for a single night's lodging. If Benjamin Thorne had decided he did not need a wife after all, if this had all been some cruel joke. "Miss Morgan," she turned toward the voice. The man who approached was indeed tall, with brown hair that needed cutting and a face weathered by sun and wind. He wore canvas work pants and a simple cotton shirt. His boots had seen hard use, but his hands, she noticed immediately, were calloused yet clean. Strong hands, working hands. This was him. This was Benjamin Thorne. "Yes," she managed, steadying her voice. "Mr. Thorne." He nodded, his expression unreadable. His eyes were gray, or perhaps blue in this particular light. They studied her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, as if he were trying to memorize her features, or searching for something he feared he might not find. "You came," he said. There was something odd in his tone. Relief, perhaps, or surprise. "Of course I came. I said I would." A moment of silence stretched between them. The platform bustled with life around them. People greeting loved ones, porters loading luggage, the general chaos of arrival and departure. But Grace felt suspended in a bubble of strange quiet, facing this man who was supposed to become her husband within the week. He was handsome, she realized with a small start, not in the refined way of Boston gentlemen, but in the rough-hewn manner of men who worked with their hands and their backs. There was something solid about him, something that suggested competence and quiet strength. She had expected worse, could have done far worse. "Is this all?" He gestured to her single bag. Heat crept into her cheeks. "Yes, I travel light. Practical." He took the bag from her, his fingers brushing hers briefly. The contact was warm despite the cold air. "The wagon is this way." She followed him through the crowd, acutely aware that people were staring. Not casual glances, true stares. A woman in a green dress stopped mid-conversation to watch them pass. Two men standing outside a saloon turned to look, and one of them said something to the other in a low voice that did not carry, but whose meaning was clear in his expression. Grace's steps faltered. "Mr. Thorne," he did not stop walking. "Call me Benjamin." "Benjamin, then." She hurried to catch up. "Is it always like this?" "Like what?" People staring. His jaw tightened, the muscles jumping beneath skin. "They are curious. You are new. It will pass." But the look in their eyes had not been mere curiosity. There had been something else there, something that looked almost like pity or warning. The wagon sat behind the general store, sturdy and well-maintained. Two horses, both well-fed and groomed. Benjamin loaded her bag with efficient movements, then offered his hand to help her up onto the seat. His grip was firm, steady, trustworthy, she told herself. He seemed trustworthy. They rolled out of town in silence, Helena thinning and disappearing behind them. The road stretched ahead, cutting through rolling grassland that seemed to go on forever. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already white with the early snow. The sky was bigger than any sky Grace had ever seen. So vast it made her feel small, insignificant. "How far is your farm?" she asked. "About 8 miles north." 8 miles from town, 8 miles from other people. The isolation of it struck her suddenly, forcefully. She would be alone with this man, this stranger, miles from help if she needed it. But was that not what she had agreed to? Had she not known, signing her name to those letters, that she was accepting exactly this? "Tell me about your land," she said, trying to fill the uncomfortable silence. "Your letters mentioned wheat." "Enough wheat. And you manage it yourself?" "Mostly." His terseness was beginning to unnerve her. She had expected awkwardness. They were strangers after all, but this felt like something more, like he was hiding something, or afraid of something. "I am a hard worker," Grace said, forcing brightness into her voice. "I may not know much about farming, but I learn quickly. I can cook, clean, mend. I keep good accounts, and I will not complain about the simple life. I meant what I wrote in my letters." Benjamin glanced at her, and for a moment his expression softened. "I know. I could tell you were sincere. That is why I chose you." Chose, as if she had been selected from a lineup, as if this were a business transaction, which she reminded herself it was. They rode in silence for another mile before Grace worked up the courage to ask the question that had been gnawing at her since the platform. "Was there someone else before me?" Benjamin's entire body went rigid. "I mean," Grace continued quickly, "your advertisement seemed practiced, as if you had done this before." "Why would you think that?" "The way people looked at me in town." That woman stared, It was like they had seen this before. People here do not have much to do besides gossip. That is not an answer. The wagon hit a rut, jolting them both. Benjamin steadied the horses before responding. There was a girl, he said finally. 3 years ago, she came from Philadelphia. What happened to her? She left. His tone made it clear the subject was closed. Montana was not what she expected, 70 years later. Benjamin's voice paused in the telling. Thomas leaned forward in his chair, caught now in the story. You lied to her, the boy said. Right from the start. I did. The old man's face was lined with regret that time had not diminished. I told myself I had good reasons, that I was protecting her. But a lie is still a lie, no matter how you dress it up. Your grandmother taught me that. She was not your grandmother yet. She was just a terrified young woman who had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man she thought was poor and honest. And I was about to show her just how wrong she was. The sun was sinking toward the mountains when they crested a rise and Benjamin pulled the horses to a stop. There, he said quietly, that is home. Grace looked. Her mind went blank. Below them, spread across the valley like something from a painting, was an estate that could have belonged to a railroad baron or an Eastern industrialist. The main house was massive, 3 stories of elegant construction with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Tall windows caught the afternoon light, gleaming like jewels. The architecture spoke of money and taste and permanence. Outbuildings clustered around the main house like attendants around royalty. A barn that could hold 50 horses, its red paint fresh and bright. A bunkhouse for workers, several equipment sheds. What looked like a manager's cottage larger than most family homes Grace had seen. Beyond the buildings, fields stretched to the horizon, not small family plots scratched from difficult land. Vast acreage that represented wealth beyond anything Grace had imagined. Wheat rippled gold in the fading light. Cattle dotted distant pastures. Fences ran straight and true for what must have been miles. This was not a farm. This was an empire. I do not understand, she whispered. Benjamin did not look at her. I may have understated things in my advertisement. Understated? The word came out sharp and high. You said you were a poor farmer. I said I was a farmer. I never said I was poor. You implied it. You said life would be simple. It is simple. I work the land. I live modestly. Grace stared at the mansion below them, at the outbuildings that spoke of industry and commerce, at the fields that went on forever. That is not modest. It is not mine by choice. Benjamin's voice was flat, distant. It was my father's, and his father's before him. I inherited it along with everything else. Everything else? Grace's voice was shaking now. What else is there? About half the farmland in this part of the territory. He said it the way someone might mention owning a spare pair of boots. Some timber rights, a few mining interests, the family business. The family business. As if that were a normal thing to inherit alongside a house. Grace's hands clenched in her lap. Her nails dug into her palms through the fabric of her gloves. Why did you lie to me? I did not lie. You deceived me. You made me think I was coming to marry a man who needed help making ends meet. Someone who... She stopped, fury and confusion roaring in her chest. Why? Why would he do this? For the first time since they had met, Benjamin turned to look at her directly. Those gray eyes held something that looked almost like desperation. Because the last girl who knew the truth, he said quietly, disappeared the night before our wedding. The words hit Grace like a physical blow. What? Elizabeth Warren, from Philadelphia. She came 3 years ago, and she knew what she was getting into. My aunt made sure of that. She knew about the house, the land, the money. She knew she would be marrying into one of the wealthiest families in Montana territory. Benjamin's jaw worked. And she disappeared. The night before the wedding, she packed her things and vanished. Or that is what we told everyone. The truth is, we do not know what happened to her. She was there when we all went to bed. By morning, she was gone. Her room was empty. Her bags were gone. It was like she had never existed. Grace's blood ran cold. Did anyone look for her? Of course we looked. The sheriff searched for weeks. We sent telegrams to Philadelphia to every town along the rail line. Nothing. It was like she had disappeared into thin air, or someone made her disappear. The words hung between them, heavy and terrible. Benjamin's hands tightened on the reins until his knuckles turned white. I do not know what happened to Elizabeth, but I know this. If wealth attracts the wrong attention, then maybe poverty or the appearance of it would be safer. Safer, Grace's voice rose. You brought me here under false pretenses because you thought lying about your fortune would keep me safe. What if whatever happened to Elizabeth happens to me? What if someone in that house— No one in the house heard Elizabeth, but Benjamin did not sound entirely convinced. If something happened to her, it came from outside. That is why I was careful this time. That is why I did not tell you the truth. Grace stared at the mansion below them, her mind reeling. She had come to Montana expecting a simple life with a simple man. Instead, she had walked into something that sounded like one of the Gothic novels the ladies at the boarding house used to read aloud. A rich man, a vanished bride, a house full of secrets. Take me back to town, she said. Grace, take me back right now. I want to go back to Helena. I want to get on the next train east. Listen to me. Benjamin's voice was urgent. I know this is a shock. I know I should have told you the truth from the beginning, but I need you to understand something. I did not bring you here to put you in danger. I brought you here because I need— He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. I need someone who is not part of this world. Someone real. Someone who came for the right reasons. The right reasons, Grace laughed, and the sound was brittle. I came because I was desperate and alone and had nowhere else to go. Those are your right reasons. Yes, he said simply, honestly, because that means you chose this life, not the money. That means I can trust you. Trust me, you lied to me. I withheld information. It is not the same thing. It absolutely is the same thing. Grace pressed her hands to her temples, trying to think through the panic. She could not do this, could not marry this man, could not walk into that house where a woman had disappeared 3 years ago and everyone pretended it had not happened. Take me back to town and I will get on the next train east. With what money? The question stopped her cold. Benjamin seemed to realize how harsh that sounded. His expression softened. I am sorry, that was cruel, but Grace, please, just give this one night. Let me explain everything properly. Meet my aunt, see the house, hear the full story. If you still want to leave in the morning, I will take you back to town myself and pay for your ticket home. You have my word. Grace wanted to refuse. Every instinct screamed at her to demand he turn the wagon around immediately. But he was right about one thing. She had no money. The last of her savings had gone to the train ticket west. She could not afford a ticket back to Boston, could not even afford a night in a boarding house. She was trapped, at least for the moment. One night, she said coldly, and you will explain everything. No more lies, no more withholding information. I want the truth about Elizabeth Warren, and I want to know exactly what I have walked into. Deal. Benjamin snapped the reins, and the wagon began rolling down toward the valley. But before they started moving, he added one more thing. Grace, one more thing. What? When we get to the house, do not trust anyone completely, not even me. 70 years later. That was when I knew I had made a terrible mistake, Benjamin said to his grandson. The sun had dropped lower now, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson. I thought I was protecting her by keeping secrets, but all I did was put her in the exact same danger that had claimed Elizabeth. And I was about to watch her walk into a house where at least one person was willing to kill to protect what we had. Thomas was silent for a long moment. Why are you telling me this now, before I leave? Benjamin looked at his grandson with eyes that had seen too much and understood too late. Because you are about to go to war. You are about to face choices that will define who you are. And I want you to understand something your great-great-grandfather never did. That wealth means nothing if it is built on blood. That power means nothing if you have to lie to keep it. That the hardest battles are not the ones fought with guns, but the ones fought with conscience. He tapped the photograph. Grace taught me that. Now finish listening to how. The house, the wagon rolled through the gates of Thorne Estate as the sun touched the mountains. Long shadows stretched across the manicured grounds. Lights were beginning to appear in the windows of the great house, warm and welcoming from a distance. Grace did not believe any of it. A woman emerged onto the porch as they approached. Tall, elegant, dressed in gray silk that probably cost more than Grace had earned in a year. Her hair was swept up in a fashionable style that spoke of money and leisure. Diamonds glinted at her throat, catching the fading light. This Grace assumed was the aunt. Benjamin brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down, then moved to help Grace. She ignored his offered hand and jumped down herself, her boots hitting the dirt with a solid thump. A small gesture of independence. A statement that she was not some helpless creature who needed assistance. The woman on the porch descended the steps with practiced grace. She was perhaps 50, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a mouth that suggested she did not smile often. "Benjamin," she said. Her voice carried the cultured tones of old money and Eastern education. "So you have brought us another bride." The phrasing made Grace's skin crawl. Another bride, as if she were just the latest in a series, as if women were interchangeable parts in some machine. "Aunt Catherine," Benjamin said. "This is Miss Grace Morgan. Grace, my Aunt Catherine Thorne." Catherine's gaze swept over Grace in a single assessing glance. Grace had the uncomfortable feeling she had just been catalog priced and found wanting. "Miss Morgan," Catherine's tone was polite but cool. "Welcome to Thorne Estate. I trust your journey was pleasant." "It was long," Grace replied, matching her tone exactly. "And educational." Catherine's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Indeed. Well, you must be exhausted. I will have Martha show you to your room. Dinner is at 7. We dress for dinner, but I am sure we can find something suitable for you." The dismissal was clear. The implication that Grace's own clothes were not suitable was even clearer. But Grace stood her ground. "Before I go anywhere, I would like to know what happened to Elizabeth Warren." Silence crashed over the porch. Catherine's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes. "I see Benjamin has been sharing family history. He said she disappeared." "She left," Catherine corrected. "There is a difference. Elizabeth realized Montana was not suitable for her and departed in the night. It was dramatic and somewhat rude, but not uncommon. Mail-order marriages do not always work out." Without a word to anyone, without taking the train. "There are other ways to travel." Catherine's voice had gained an edge. "Miss Morgan, I understand you are confused and perhaps frightened. That is natural. But I assure you whatever happened to Elizabeth was her own choice. No one here wishes you harm." "Well, then why does everyone keep warning me?" Catherine shot Benjamin a sharp look. "What exactly have you been telling her?" "The truth," Benjamin said quietly. "She deserves that much." Before Catherine could respond, another figure appeared in the doorway. A girl perhaps 16 with auburn hair and a pretty face marred by weariness that seemed too old for her years. "Is this her?" the girl asked softly. "Miss Morgan," Catherine said, her composure returning. "This is my daughter, Sarah." Sarah descended the steps slowly. When she reached Grace, she leaned in close enough to whisper words that only Grace could hear. "Leave tonight if you can. Do not stay here." Then she stepped back, her expression carefully neutral, and said in a normal voice, "Welcome to Thorne Estate, Miss Morgan. I do hope you will be comfortable." The warning was clear. The fear in Sarah's eyes was real. And Grace realized with cold certainty that she had just walked into something far more dangerous than she had imagined. Whatever secrets Thorne Estate held, they were worth threatening a desperate woman over. They were worth making a 16-year-old girl terrified in her own home. They might even be worth murder. The room Martha, the housekeeper, led Grace up a sweeping staircase to the second floor. The interior of the house matched its exterior promise. Polished wood floors gleamed in lamplight. Expensive furniture filled rooms glimpsed through doorways. Paintings hung on walls, their subjects stern and disapproving. Ancestors probably, generations of thorns staring down with cold eyes at those who walked their halls. This was what Benjamin had hidden from her. This wealth, this power, this weight of family history and accumulated fortune. Martha walked with the careful neutrality of a servant who had learned to see much and say little. She led Grace down a long hallway lined with closed doors. At the end, she opened a room and gestured Grace inside. "This was Miss Elizabeth's room," Martha said quietly. "Miss Thorne had it prepared for you." Of course it was. Of course they would put her in the missing girl's room. The space was beautiful. A four-poster bed dominated the center, dressed in fine linens that looked softer than anything Grace had ever touched. A wardrobe stood against one wall, large enough to hold 10 times the clothes Grace owned. A vanity with a real silver mirror. A washstand with a porcelain basin. French doors opened onto a small balcony overlooking the grounds. It looked like a room in a fairy tale, a princess's chamber, a place of comfort and luxury. Grace set her carpet bag on the bed and turned to Martha. What really happened to Elizabeth? Martha's eyes widened. I could not say miss. Could not or will not. Could not. Martha's voice dropped even lower. Because I do not know. None of us know. One night she was here. The next morning she was gone. Her things were packed, but she did not take the wagon or the horses. She just disappeared. Do you think someone hurt her? Or Martha's face went pale. I think you should have your bath and dress for dinner, miss. And I think you should be very careful about asking too many questions. She left before Grace could respond, closing the door with a soft click. Grace stood in the middle of Elizabeth Warren's room, surrounded by luxuries she had never dreamed of, and felt more alone than she had ever felt in her life. She had come to Montana seeking safety and security. Instead, she had found a gilded cage with bars she could not yet see. But Grace Morgan had survived poverty and loss in loneliness. She would survive this too. She walked to the French doors and stepped out onto the balcony. The sun had set and stars were beginning to appear in the vast Montana sky. The grounds below were quiet, beautiful, deceptive. Somewhere out there, Elizabeth Warren had disappeared. And now Grace was sleeping in her room, wearing her dresses, walking the same floors, following the same path. As she turned to go back inside, something caught her eye. A small gap between two floorboards on the balcony. Something white was wedged there, barely visible in the fading light. Grace knelt and worked it free with her fingers. Paper, old and weathered, the edges soft with time and exposure. The ink had faded, but she could still make out 4 words written in a shaking hand. They are watching. Trust no one. It was signed with a single initial. Elizabeth had left a warning, and 3 years later, Grace had found it. She looked up at the house, at the windows glowing with warm light, at the elegant facade that hid so many secrets. Benjamin Thorne had asked her to give it one night, to hear the full story. But as Grace stood on that balcony with Elizabeth's warning in her hand, she realized the full story was far darker than anyone had been willing to tell her. And she was going to uncover every secret this house held, even if it killed her. Grace slipped the note into her pocket and returned inside. The room suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. Beautiful wallpaper and expensive furniture could not disguise the fact that she was standing in a missing woman's bedroom, holding a warning that woman had left behind. A knock at the door made her jump. Miss Morgan, Martha's voice came through the wood. I have brought your bath water. Grace opened the door to find the housekeeper accompanied by 2 young maids carrying steaming buckets. They worked efficiently, filling a copper tub that had been positioned behind a decorative screen in the corner of the room. Martha laid out towels and a small cake of lavender soap. Mrs. Thorne sent up a dress for dinner, Martha said, gesturing to a gown laid across the bed, deep green silk, far finer than anything Grace had ever worn. She thought your traveling clothes might need airing out. The implication was clear. Grace's worn wool dress was not suitable for dinner at Thorne Estate. She was being dressed for a part in a play she had not auditioned for. Grace bathed quickly, trying not to enjoy the luxury of hot water and expensive soap. She needed to stay alert, not lulled into complacency by comfort. As she dried off and examined the green silk dress, she noticed how perfectly it fit, as if it had been made for her measurements, or for someone with her measurements. Had this been Elizabeth's dress? Had Elizabeth stood in the same spot wearing this same silk, preparing for a dinner where everyone smiled and lied? A bell chimed somewhere in the house. Dinner. Grace took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped into the hallway. The dining room was another display of wealth. A table that could seat 20 was set for 5. Crystal glasses caught the light from an enormous chandelier. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced men and severe women. Generations of Thorns staring down with cold eyes. Catherine sat at the head of the table, still in her gray silk. Sarah took a seat to her left. Benjamin stood by the fireplace, changed into proper dinner clothes that made him look less like a farmer and more like what he actually was, a wealthy landowner. The fourth person was a stranger, a man perhaps 40 years old with silver threading through his dark hair and an expensive suit that marked him as someone important. He stood when Grace entered, his eyes appraising her with the same calculating look Catherine had used earlier. "Miss Morgan," Catherine said smoothly, "may I introduce Mr. William Drake? He manages our business interests and serves as the family's legal counsel. William, this is Miss Grace Morgan, Benjamin's intended bride." Intended, not betrothed, not fiancée. Intended as if Grace were a transaction still being negotiated. "Miss Morgan," Drake's voice was cultured Eastern. "A pleasure. Benjamin has told me very little about you." Grace took the seat Benjamin pulled out for her. "There is little to tell, Mr. Drake. I am an orphan from Boston who answered a matrimonial advertisement. Hardly the stuff of interesting conversation." On the contrary, Drake settled back into his chair as servants Grace had not seen before began serving the first course. "I find your story quite fascinating. What would drive a young woman to travel 2,000 miles to marry a complete stranger?" The question was invasive, but Drake asked it with such casual interest that refusing to answer would seem churlish. "Desperation," Grace said honestly. "I was working as a housemaid with no prospects and no family. Mr. Thorne's advertisement offered honest work and a respectable life. I took the chance." "Honest," Drake repeated as if tasting the word. "An interesting choice of words. And now that you have seen what you have actually gotten yourself into, what do you think?" William Benjamin said quietly, a warning in his tone. "I am merely making conversation, Benjamin." Miss Morgan seems intelligent enough to handle direct questions. Drake smiled at Grace, but the expression did not reach his eyes. After all, she will need to be intelligent if she is going to be the next Mrs. Thorne. Catherine set down her soup spoon with a sharp click. "Perhaps we should discuss something more pleasant over dinner. Miss Morgan, tell us about Boston. Do you miss it terribly?" The change of subject was so obvious it was almost insulting, but Grace played along. The meal continued through multiple courses. Fish replaced soup. Roasted meat replaced fish. The food was excellent, but Grace could barely taste it. She was too focused on the currents of tension flowing around the table. Benjamin's silence, his jaw tight. Catherine maintaining a stream of polite small talk that revealed nothing. Sarah watching everyone with wary eyes. And Drake studying Grace like she was a problem he was trying to solve. Then Sarah asked the innocent question that changed everything. "No family at all, no one who will worry about you?" Grace looked at the girl's pretty troubled face. "No one." The word fell into silence, and Grace realized she had just told these people, these strangers who were hiding something about a missing woman, that no one in the world would come looking for her if she disappeared. Drake's smile widened slightly as if she had confirmed something he had suspected. "I understand Benjamin told you about our previous disappointment," Catherine finally said. "About Miss Warren. He mentioned she disappeared." "And she left," Catherine corrected sharply. "I wish people would stop making it sound so sinister." Elizabeth simply realized this life was not for her and departed. "It happens." In the middle of the night, Grace pressed, without a word. She was always dramatic. Catherine waved a dismissive hand. "From Philadelphia high society, you understand. She had certain expectations that were not met." "What expectations?" Grace demanded. "Benjamin said she knew about the family's wealth before she came." "She knew about the money," Drake interjected smoothly. "What she did not know was the history." Elizabeth became somewhat obsessed with how the Thorne fortune was built. She read old newspapers, talked to people in town, asked uncomfortable questions about property transfers and land claims from the territorial days. And what did she discover? The question hung in the air for a long moment. Benjamin set down his glass. "She discovered that my grandfather was not always an honest man, that some of the land that makes up this estate was acquired through methods that were legal at the time, but would not be considered ethical now." "Legal is such a flexible term in territorial days," Drake added. "The West was being settled. Fortunes were being made. Your grandfather Benjamin was simply better at it than most." "Better at what?" Grace demanded. "What exactly did he do?" Catherine's eyes flashed. "He built an empire from nothing. He saw opportunities and took them. That is what successful men do, Miss Morgan. They do not apologize for their ambition." "But Elizabeth thought he should apologize for something," Grace said. "What was it? What did she find?" "Nothing that concerns you," Catherine said coldly. "Benjamin, I think perhaps you should explain to Miss Hart that this family's history is private. She has a right to know what she is marrying into, Benjamin has said quietly. She has a right to become your wife and enjoy the benefits of this family's success, Catherine shot back. She does not have a right to dredge up old scandals that have nothing to do with her. Unless those scandals got Elizabeth killed, Grace said. The words exploded across the table like a gunshot. Catherine went white. Sarah gasped. Drake's expression went completely blank, the look of a lawyer who just heard something important. Benjamin closed his eyes briefly as if in pain. That, Catherine said, her voice shaking with fury, is a serious accusation, one you cannot possibly prove. Then prove me wrong, Grace challenged. Show me evidence that Elizabeth left safely. Show me a telegram from her. A letter. Anything that proves she made it away from here alive. Before anyone could respond, Benjamin stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. Grace, a word. Now. He strode from the dining room without waiting for a response. Grace hesitated, then followed, very aware that every eye at the table was on her back, 70 years later. Benjamin paused in his telling, his old hands trembling slightly on the arms of his chair. The sun had dropped below the mountains, now painting the sky in shades of purple and deep blue. You accuse them of murder, Thomas said, right there at the dinner table. She did. Benjamin's voice held equal parts admiration and regret. And that was the moment I realized I had not brought a helpless victim to Thorne Estate. I had brought a warrior, someone who would fight for the truth no matter the cost. He looked at his grandson. Remember that boy, when you are overseas and you see injustice, when you watch powerful men do terrible things and expect silence. Remember that speaking truth to power is the bravest thing a person can do. Grace taught me that. Now let me tell you what happened next. The confession. Benjamin led Grace to his study, a room lined with bookshelves filled with ledgers and legal documents. He closed the door and rounded on her. What are you doing? You just accused my family of murder over dinner. If your family would give me straight answers instead of veiled warnings and polite lies, I would not have to accuse anyone of anything. Grace's hands clenched into fists. You brought me here under false pretenses, Benjamin. You lied about who you are and what kind of life I would be walking into. Now I find out the last woman who stood where I am standing is missing, possibly dead, and everyone in this house is acting like it is perfectly normal. It is not normal. Benjamin's voice dropped. God knows it is not normal. But Grace, there are things you do not understand. Then make me understand. Tell me what really happened to Elizabeth Warren. I do not know. The admission seemed torn from him. I swear to you I do not know. She was in her room when I went to bed. By morning she was gone. Her clothes, her bags, everything gone. Like she had never been here at all. And you think she just walked away in the middle of the night across 8 miles of open territory? I think Benjamin ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. I think something frightened her badly enough to run. But I do not know what. She would not tell me. She must have said something. Sarah said you two talked, that Elizabeth asked you questions. She asked about my grandfather. Benjamin moved to pour himself a drink from a crystal decanter, about how he acquired the land, about specific families, specific transactions. I told her what I knew, which was not much. My grandfather died when I was 10. I inherited everything when my father passed 5 years ago, but I never paid attention to how it was built. I was just a child. But Elizabeth found something that scared her. If she did, she never told me what it was. He downed the drink in one swallow. The night before she disappeared, she came to me, said she needed to speak with me privately. We walked in the gardens, and she asked me if I knew what my grandfather had done to the Henderson family. Who were they? Farmers who used to own land about 10 miles north of here. That was 40 years ago. Their farm is part of the estate now. What happened to them? They sold out and moved east. At least that is what the records show. Benjamin set down his glass, but Elizabeth said she had talked to someone in town who remembered it differently, who said the Hendersons did not sell. They were forced out. How? Benjamin's voice was flat, matter of fact, as if he were reciting a list of business transactions rather than describing terror and violence. Their barn burned down. Their livestock died under mysterious circumstances. Their eldest son was beaten by unknown assailants. After 6 months of this, they finally agreed to sell the land for a fraction of what it was worth. Grace felt cold spread through her chest. He terrorized them into selling. It would appear so, and if he did it to the Hendersons, he probably did it to others. Elizabeth was trying to find proof, trying to track down descendants of families who had been pushed off their land. Why, what did she plan to do with that information? I do not know. She would not tell me. She just asked if I would help her find the truth, if I would be willing to make restitution if we discovered my family had stolen these properties. Benjamin met Grace's eyes. I said yes. I told her I did not care about the land or the money, that if we had built this fortune on other people's suffering, I wanted to make it right. And then she disappeared. And then she disappeared, Benjamin echoed. The next morning, Aunt Catherine found her room empty. We searched everywhere, sent men in every direction. Nothing. It was like she had vanished into thin air. Or someone made her vanish because she was asking the wrong questions. Benjamin's jaw tightened. That is what I am afraid of. Who would have done it? Your aunt. Catherine is ruthless about protecting the family name, but murder. He shook his head. I cannot see it. She is cold, but she is not a killer. What about Drake? William has been with the family for 15 years. He manages everything, knows all the secrets. If anyone would kill to protect the Thorne fortune, it would be him. Benjamin paused. But again, I have no proof, no evidence, just suspicions and a missing woman. Why did you bring me here, Benjamin? The real reason, if you think someone in this house might be a murderer, why would you bring another woman into danger? Because I am running out of time. His voice was rough. There are men who want this land. Powerful men with connections in the territorial government. They have been pressuring me to sell to divide up the estate. I have been refusing, but my legal position is weak because I am unmarried. According to territorial law, an unmarried man's land can be challenged more easily than a married man's estate. So you need a wife to secure your legal claim. I need a wife to buy time, Benjamin corrected. Time to find out what really happened to Elizabeth. Time to uncover whatever corruption my grandfather built his fortune on. Time to figure out who I can trust. Grace stared at him. And you thought lying to me was the way to do that. I thought bringing in someone from outside, someone with no connection to the territory, no stake in the politics, might keep you safer. He laughed bitterly. I see now how stupid that was. I have just put you in the same position as Elizabeth. A knock at the door interrupted them. Drake's voice came through the wood. Benjamin, Mrs. Thorne would like to speak with you, and Miss Morgan should retire for the evening. It has been a long day. It was phrased as a suggestion, but the tone made it clear it was an order. Benjamin moved to open the door. Drake stood there, his expression unreadable. Miss Morgan, Drake said smoothly, I apologize if dinner was uncomfortable. This family has its tensions, as all families do. I hope you will not judge us too harshly. I am not here to judge anyone, Mr. Drake. I am here to understand what I have walked into. A complicated situation, to be sure. But Benjamin is a good man, and this estate, despite its history, provides livelihoods for dozens of families. Whatever sins were committed in the past, the present is what matters now. He smiled that empty smile again. I suggest you get some rest. Tomorrow things will look clearer. It was a dismissal, and fighting it would accomplish nothing. Grace nodded and moved past Drake into the hallway. Benjamin caught her arm gently. Grace, lock your door tonight, and if you hear anything unusual, anything at all, come find me. My room is at the other end of the hall. The warning sent ice down her spine, but she kept her voice steady. I will. Thank you. Night sounds. Grace returned to her room, very aware that somewhere in this house, Catherine Thorne was likely telling Benjamin exactly what she thought of his choice of bride. Very aware that Drake was watching her with those calculating eyes. Very aware that Sarah was frightened of something she would not name. The room felt colder than before. Grace lit the lamps and checked the door lock twice. Then she moved to the balcony and retrieved the note she had found earlier, reading it again by lamplight. They are watching. Trust no one. Who had Elizabeth been afraid of? Catherine Drake. Someone else entirely. Grace changed into her nightgown, plain cotton, so different from the silk dress she had worn to dinner. and sat on the edge of the massive bed. Her carpet bag sat in the corner packed and ready. She could leave. Walk out right now, make her way back to town somehow. Throw herself on the mercy of strangers. But that would solve nothing. She would still have no money, no prospects, nowhere to go. And whoever had hurt Elizabeth, if someone had hurt Elizabeth, would get away with it. A sound from the hallway made her freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching her door. They stopped right outside. Grace held her breath, watching the door handle. It did not turn, but she could see a shadow in the gap beneath the door. Someone was standing there, listening. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated. Grace exhaled shakily and moved to press her ear against the door. She could hear voices below. Catherine and Drake, she thought, though she could not make out the words. They were arguing about something, their tone sharp. She crept back to bed, but did not sleep. Every creak of the house settling made her jump. Every distant sound could be someone approaching her room. Somewhere around midnight, she heard a door open and close. Then footsteps on the stairs. Someone leaving the house. Grace moved to the window and peered out. In the moonlight, she could see a figure walking across the grounds toward the stables. It looked like Drake, but she could not be certain. Where was he going in the middle of the night? The question gnawed at her, but she did not dare follow. Not yet, not until she understood more about what was happening here. She must have dozed eventually because she woke to gray dawn light and the sound of horses outside. When she looked out the window, she saw 3 men on horseback approaching the house. They were not ranch hands. Their clothes were too fine, their bearing too authoritative. One of them, heavy-set man with silver hair, dismounted and strode toward the front door with the confidence of someone who expected to be welcomed. Grace dressed quickly and slipped into the hallway. She could hear voices rising from downstairs. Benjamin strained and angry, and another man smooth and threatening. She crept to the top of the stairs and peered down into the entrance hall. Carson Benjamin stood facing the silver-haired man, with Drake and Catherine flanking him. The 2 other riders had remained outside, but their presence was clearly meant as intimidation. "You cannot keep refusing Thorne," the silver-haired man was saying. "This railroad is coming through whether you cooperate or not. All you are doing is delaying the inevitable and making enemies you cannot afford." "The land is not for sale, Carson," Benjamin said flatly. "How many times do I have to tell you that everything is for sale at the right price?" Carson's voice was smooth, reasonable, the tone of a man used to getting what he wanted. "Or have you forgotten what happened to the last person who tried to interfere with my plans?" The threat was barely veiled. Benjamin's hands clenched. "If you are implying what I think you are implying, I am implying nothing. I am simply noting that Miss Warren asked a lot of inconvenient questions and then conveniently disappeared before she could cause real trouble." Carson turned and saw Grace at the top of the stairs. His eyes swept over her with cold appraisal. "Ah, and here is the new Mrs. Thorne, or soon to be anyway." He smiled, and it was the smile of a predator. "Pretty thing. It would be a shame if she started asking the same questions." "Get out of my house," Benjamin said. "I will leave when I am ready to leave." Carson turned to Catherine. "Mrs. Thorne, you are a sensible woman. Surely you can see that your nephew is being foolish. This land could make you all wealthy beyond your current means. Why protect it so jealously?" "The land has been in our family for 2 generations," Catherine said, but her voice wavered slightly. "We do not sell our heritage." Carson laughed. "Your heritage is built on theft and violence. I have seen the records. Talk to the families your father-in-law destroyed. If those stories became public, if someone were to bring legal challenges based on the original claims," he spread his hands, "this whole estate could be seized by the territorial government. And then where would you be?" "You are threatening us," Drake said quietly. "I am presenting options. Sell to me now for a generous price, or watch your empire crumble when the truth comes out." Carson's eyes swept the room and landed on Grace again. "Tell me, my dear, does your intended husband tell you the truth about anything? Has he told you that this house was built with blood money, that families were terrorized homes, burned people, beaten, and driven from their land so the Thornes could build their fortune?" "He has told me enough," Grace said, descending the stairs. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Has he told you what happened to the girl who came before you, the one who asked too many questions?" If you have information about Elizabeth Warren, Mr. Carson, you should take it to the sheriff. Carson's smile widened. The sheriff works for the Thorns, my dear. Everyone in Helena works for them one way or another. That is what 40 years of corruption buys. A town too scared to stand against you. He turned back to Grace. If you want the truth about what happened to Elizabeth, come find me at the Grand Hotel in Helena. I will tell you everything. Things your fiancé will not. Do not listen to him, Benjamin said urgently. He is trying to divide us, to use you against me. Of course I am using her, Carson interrupted cheerfully. But that does not mean I am lying. Ask yourself, Miss Morgan. What kind of man lies about being poor when he is actually wealthy? What kind of person uses deception as the foundation for a marriage? And what else might he be lying about? He tipped his hat and strode out, his boots echoing on the polished floor. Through the window, Grace watched him mount his horse and ride away with his men, leaving a wake of tension behind him. Catherine rounded on Benjamin the moment the door closed. This is exactly what I was afraid of. You brought another outsider into this house, and now she is going to tear everything apart just like Elizabeth tried to do. Grace is not Elizabeth, Benjamin said quietly. No, she is worse. Catherine's voice shook with fury. Elizabeth at least had the grace to disappear quietly. This one is going to get us all killed 70 years later. Benjamin's voice had grown rough. Thomas could see tears in his grandfather's eyes, though the old man made no move to wipe them away. Carson, Thomas said. He was the railroad man. He was the devil, Benjamin replied. A man who would do anything for profit, who had already killed once and would kill again. And he had just offered to tell Grace everything I had been trying to hide, every sin my family had committed, every terrible truth I had been too much a coward to speak. The old man looked at his grandson. That was when I learned that you cannot protect people by keeping secrets. You can only put them in greater danger, because the truth always comes out. And when it does, it is twice as destructive if you have tried to hide it. The raid the next morning brought the sound of more horses, but these riders wore stars on their vests. Sheriff Daniel Cooper was perhaps 50, with gray in his mustache and the weathered look of a man who had spent decades enforcing law in a lawless place. He dismounted with the heavy movements of someone who did not want to be there. Benjamin opened the door before the sheriff could knock. Sheriff Cooper? What brings you out here? Benjamin, Mrs. Thorne. Cooper removed his hat, his expression apologetic. I am sorry to disturb you, but I have received some information that requires investigation. What kind of information? Drake demanded. About the disappearance of Elizabeth Warren 3 years ago. Cooper's gaze swept the entrance hall and landed on Grace. And I understand you have another young woman staying here now, a Miss Morgan. I am Grace Morgan, she said, stepping forward. What is this about? Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions, and I need to search the premises. On what grounds? Drake's lawyer voice was sharp. You cannot just come here making accusations. I am not making accusations. I am following up on information provided by a federal investigator. Cooper pulled a folded paper from his pocket. This is a warrant signed by the territorial judge. It gives me authority to search this property and question all residents regarding the disappearance and suspected murder of Elizabeth Warren. Murder! The words seemed to echo through the hall. Catherine swayed slightly, and Sarah rushed down the stairs to support her. Benjamin's face had gone white. Only Drake seemed unsurprised, as if he had been expecting this moment. Federal investigator. Benjamin's voice was hoarse. What federal investigator? That would be me. The voice came from behind Cooper. A woman stepped into view, perhaps 30 years old, dressed in a practical traveling suit with sharp eyes and a badge pinned to her lapel. Special Agent Rachel Hayes, Department of Justice. I have been investigating territorial land fraud for the past 2 years. She looked directly at Grace, and I think Miss Morgan might have information that could help my investigation. Grace's mind reeled. I just arrived yesterday. I do not know anything. But you are asking questions, are you not? The same questions Elizabeth Warren asked before she disappeared. Hayes entered the house without invitation, her gaze cataloging every detail. Elizabeth Warren was not a mail-order bride. She was an investigator working for my department. We sent her here to gather evidence about how the Thorne estate was built and whether current territorial officials were complicit in covering up historical crimes. The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Elizabeth had been a federal agent. Everything, the advertisement, the engagement, the planned wedding, had been an elaborate cover. You sent her here. Benjamin's voice was raw. You sent a woman into danger without backup, without protection. We thought she would be safe, Hayes said, but her tone carried guilt. We thought she could gather evidence and get out before anyone realized what she was doing. We were wrong. She is dead, is not she, Grace heard herself ask. Elizabeth is dead. Hayes's expression was answer enough. Catherine made a sound like a wounded animal and sank into a chair. Sarah was crying openly now, her hands pressed to her mouth. Benjamin stood frozen, processing the implications. Only Drake seemed to maintain his composure. Agent Hayes, if you have evidence of a crime, present it. Otherwise, this is harassment. Oh, I have evidence, Mr. Drake. 3 years' worth. Hayes gestured to Cooper and the other men. Sheriff, your deputies can start the search. I want every room examined, every outbuilding checked. If Elizabeth Warren's body is on this property, we are going to find it. Cooper and his deputies moved into the house and the organized chaos of a search began. Furniture was moved. Floorboards examined. Closets emptied. The violation of privacy was absolute. Grace watched with growing dread, feeling the weight of history pressing down on them all. 3 years Elizabeth had been missing. 3 years of lies and cover-ups and fear. And now the truth was going to come out. Whether any of them were ready for it or not, the hidden box. The discovery came in Benjamin's study. A deputy found a seam in the wood panel behind the bookshelf. A hidden compartment cleverly disguised. Inside was a wooden box, old and locked, made of heavy oak. That is my father-in-law's private box, Catherine said, her voice shaking. You have no right. We have every right, Hayes said. She produced a set of lockpicks and went to work on the box. It took her less than a minute to get it open. Inside were papers. Dozens of them yellowed with age, covered in neat handwriting. Hayes pulled out the top document and began to read. Her expression went from interested to shocked to horrified in the space of seconds. What is it? Cooper demanded. Contracts, Hayes said, her voice hollow. Contracts signed by Jonathan Thorne agreeing to pay men to intimidate homesteaders. Receipts for payments made after specific incidents. And letters. She pulled out a stack of correspondence. Letters detailing exactly what methods should be used to force people off their land. Catherine made a strangled sound. That is impossible. Jonathan would never have written any of this down. But he did. Hayes spread several letters across the desk. Here is one ordering the burning of the Henderson barn. Here is another authorizing payment to men who beat a farmer named Collins into leaving the territory. And this one, her voice caught. This one is a receipt for $2,000 paid to a man named Sykes for permanent removal of a witness to the Collins beating. Murder for hire, in writing. The room had gone deathly silent. Grace could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of decades of violence pressing down on them all. Benjamin moved to the desk and picked up one of the letters. His hands shook as he read it. This is my grandfather's handwriting, he said, his voice barely audible. I recognize it from other documents. This is real. Of course it is real, Catherine snapped. But there was no strength behind it now. She looked like she had aged 10 years in the past hour. Jonathan was a hard man. He did what he had to do to build this estate, but that was 40 years ago. Murder does not have a statute of limitations, Mrs. Thorne, Hayes said coldly. An obstruction of justice, which is what I suspect has been happening for the past 3 years, is also a crime. We did not obstruct anything, Drake said, but even he seemed shaken now. We did not know about these documents. Did you not? Hayes fixed him with a hard stare. You have been the family lawyer for 15 years, Mr. Drake. You manage all their legal affairs. Are you telling me you never knew about this box? Drake's silence was damning. Hayes gestured to Cooper. Sheriff, I am placing William Drake under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to conceal a federal investigation. Now wait. Drake backed away. You cannot prove I knew anything about Elizabeth Warren. Can I not? Hayes pulled another document from the box. This is a letter dated April 15th, 1881, 2 weeks after Elizabeth arrived at this estate. It is from you, Mr. Drake, to a man named Carson. Samuel Carson, to be specific. The railroad man, the one who had been here just an hour ago making threats. Hayes read aloud. Carson, the girl, is asking too many questions about the Henderson property. If she keeps digging, she is going to find the old contracts. Suggest you accelerate your plans for acquisition. The family cannot afford an investigation right now. Grace felt the pieces clicking into place. Drake had been working with Carson all along. He had wanted the family to sell the land to him. You were working with Carson, she said. You wanted them to sell. It was good business, Drake said, his composure cracking. The railroad was offering an excellent price, and the estate was becoming a liability. I was trying to protect the family's interests. By selling out to the man who wanted them destroyed, Benjamin's voice was shaking with rage. By conspiring with Carson, I was being practical. This estate is built on blood and corruption. It was only a matter of time before someone like Elizabeth came along and exposed everything. Drake's mask had completely fallen away now, revealing the calculating opportunist beneath. I tried to convince Catherine to sell. I tried to make you see reason, Benjamin. But none of you would listen. So I told Carson there was a problem that needed to be dealt with. That is all. But Drake's eyes darted to the door, calculating his chances of escape. Cooper moved to block his path, hand on his gun. Do not even think about it. Did you kill her? Benjamin's voice was deadly quiet. Did you kill Elizabeth Warren? I did not touch her. I swear, I told Carson she was a problem. What he did after that, you told a known criminal that a federal agent was investigating him, and you are claiming you did not know what would happen. Hayes's voice dripped contempt. Take him, Sheriff, and I want guards posted. Nobody leaves this property until we finish searching. Cooper and his deputies moved to restrain Drake. The lawyer did not fight, but his face had gone gray with fear. Wait, he said suddenly. Wait, I will tell you everything. I will tell you who killed Elizabeth. Where they put the body. All of it. But I want immunity. I want a deal. Hayes considered him coldly. You are in no position to negotiate. I know where she is, Drake said desperately. I know exactly where they buried her. And I know who did it. Give me immunity, and I will give you everything. The room held its collective breath. Hayes looked at Cooper, who nodded slightly. Then she turned back to Drake. Talk, she said, and this better be good. Drake swallowed hard. It was Catherine. Catherine Thorne killed Elizabeth Warren. The accusation hit like lightning. Catherine, who had been slumped in her chair, straightened suddenly. Her face went from pale to flushed with fury. You lying son of a... She found out Elizabeth was an investigator. Drake continued, his words tumbling out. I do not know how. Maybe she intercepted the telegram. Maybe she overheard something. But 3 years ago, the night Elizabeth disappeared, Catherine came to my office in Helena. She told me there had been an accident, that Elizabeth had fallen from her balcony and broken her neck. Grace's blood ran cold. The balcony outside her room, Elizabeth's room, that was where she had died. She said it was an accident, Drake went on. Said Elizabeth had been trying to climb down to escape and had slipped. She asked me to help her hide the body, to make it look like Elizabeth had simply run away. And you helped her, Hayes said flatly. I did not have a choice. Catherine was hysterical. She kept saying the family would be destroyed if the truth came out, that we would all go to prison. I was weak. I should have gone to the authorities, but I was terrified. Drake's hands were shaking now. We took the body to the old Henderson property, the burned-out farm that started all of this. There is a well there abandoned and partially collapsed. We put Elizabeth's body down the well and covered it with stones. Silence crashed through the study. Sarah was sobbing quietly. Benjamin stood frozen, staring at his aunt with an expression of utter betrayal. Catherine rose from her chair with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had nothing left to lose. It was not an accident, she said, her voice eerily calm. I pushed her. The confession hung in the air, stark and terrible. Catherine Thorne, you are under arrest for the murder of Elizabeth Warren, Hayes said. Let me finish. Catherine's eyes were distant, as if she were seeing something no one else could see. I found the telegram she had sent. It was in her room, a copy she had kept. I realized what she was, a spy, a federal agent sent to destroy everything my family had built. So I confronted her that night on the balcony. I told her to leave, to forget everything she had learned. to go back east. But she refused. She said she had a duty, Catherine continued, said justice mattered more than protecting criminals, even if those criminals were long dead. Catherine's laugh was bitter. Justice, as if there is any such thing in this territory. The strong survive, Miss Morgan. That is the only law that matters out here. So you killed her. I pushed her off the balcony. She fell 3 stories onto the stone patio below. I heard her neck break. Catherine's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were describing something mundane. Then I woke William and we disposed of the body. We cleaned up the blood, packed her things, made it look like she had run away. She turned to Benjamin, and for the first time emotion cracked through her facade. I did it to protect you, to protect Sarah, to protect everything this family built. Your grandfather may have used harsh methods, but he gave us all a future. I was not going to let some federal agent destroy that. You murdered an innocent woman, Benjamin said, his voice breaking. You murdered her and let me bring another woman here. Let Grace walk into the same danger. I thought if we found the right bride, someone compliant, someone who would not ask questions. Catherine's voice rose. I thought we could move past this. I thought we could finally be safe. Safe, Grace's fury finally broke through. You murdered Elizabeth and then tried to replace her like she was a broken dish. You put me in her room, let me wear her clothes, all while her body was rotting in a well. I did what I had to do, Catherine said, but her conviction was crumbling now. You would not understand. None of you understand what it means to protect a legacy, to preserve what your family built. Your family built a fortune on murder and theft. Hayes cut her off. And you continued that tradition by killing a federal agent. There is no legacy there, Mrs. Thorne, just blood. Cooper moved to restrain Catherine. She did not fight, just stood there with tears streaming down her face. Sarah, she said, looking at her daughter. Sarah, please understand. I did this for you, for your future. But Sarah turned away, unable to look at her mother. The deputies led Catherine and Drake out of the house in shackles. Their footsteps echoed on the polished floors, and then they were gone, leaving behind a silence heavy with horror and grief. Hayes sent men to the old Henderson property that same day. By evening, word came back. They had found her. Elizabeth Warren's remains still wrapped in the clothes she had worn 3 years ago, at the bottom of a collapsed well covered with stones, just as Drake had described. The news hit Grace like a fist to the stomach. She had known somewhere deep inside that Elizabeth was dead. But knowing and having it confirmed were 2 different things. A young woman not much older than Grace herself had come to Montana seeking justice and found only violence. Federal Marshal Crawford arrived the next morning, a man in his 50s with the bearing of someone who had seen too much and forgotten none of it. He took one look at the situation and made immediate arrangements. Miss Morgan, you cannot stay here, he said. Not until we know who else might have been involved. Mrs. Chen runs a boarding house in town. Discreet, trustworthy. You will be safe there while we prepare for trial. Grace surprised herself by speaking up. What about Sarah? She is only 16. She cannot stay here alone with her mother arrested. Crawford looked at the girl who sat pale and trembling in the corner of the room. You are right, but she will need a guardian. I will do it, Grace said. The words came out before she had fully thought them through, but once spoken, she knew they were right. We can share a room at the boarding house. I can look after her. Benjamin, who had been silent since his aunt's arrest, finally spoke. That would be kind of you. Sarah needs someone right now, and I... He gestured helplessly. I will be dealing with lawyers and investigators. I cannot give her the attention she needs. So it was arranged. Grace and Sarah packed their few belongings and were taken to Mrs. Chen's boarding house, a neat 2-story building on a quiet street. Mrs. Chen was a small, efficient woman in her 60s who took one look at Sarah's tear-stained face and immediately began preparing tea and food. You will be safe here, she said in accented but clear English. I have 2 other boarders, both miners, good men. They work days, sleep nights, no trouble. Your room is upstairs, corner window. Good lock on door. The room was simple but clean. 2 narrow beds, a washstand, a small table with 2 chairs. After the opulence of Thorne Estate, it felt almost austere. But to Grace, who had spent years in boarding houses, it felt familiar. Safe. Sarah collapsed onto one of the beds and curled into a ball. I want my mother, she whispered. Grace sat beside her, stroking her hair with gentle motions. I know. She killed someone. She killed that woman and never told me. How could she do that? How could she kill someone and then just keep living like nothing happened? I do not know, Grace said honestly. People convince themselves of terrible things when they think they are protecting the people they love. Your mother made a horrible choice. But Sarah, that does not mean she did not love you. She did terrible things in your name, but the love was real. I do not want her love if it costs someone their life. I know, and you are right to feel that way. Grace paused, choosing her words carefully. But you are going to have to find a way to live with what she did, to separate who you are from who she is. You are not responsible for her crimes. You are your own person. Am I? Sarah's voice was muffled against the pillow. Everyone in this territory knows who I am now. Catherine Thorne's daughter, the daughter of a murderer. That is all I will ever be. Only if you let it define you. Only if you choose to carry her shame instead of making your own path. Grace thought about her own past, her own losses. I lost everything when my father died. I had to rebuild myself from nothing. It was hard, but it also meant I got to decide who I wanted to be. No expectations, no inherited identity, just me making my own choices. Sarah was quiet for a long time. Then what should I do? For now, grieve. Be angry. Feel whatever you need to feel. But do not let what your mother did destroy you too. That would be letting her claim another victim. They sat together in the gathering darkness until Mrs. Chen knocked softly and brought up dinner. Simple fare, but hot and plentiful. Sarah picked at her food, but eventually ate a little. It was a start. The visit that evening, as Sarah finally slept, a knock came at the door. Grace opened it to find Benjamin standing in the hallway, hat in hand, looking uncertain. I wanted to check on Sarah, he said quietly. Make sure she is all right. She is sleeping, finally. Grace stepped into the hallway and closed the door softly. It has been a long day for her, for all of us. Benjamin looked exhausted, older than his 30 years. The lines around his eyes had deepened. His shoulders sagged with the weight of generations. Grace, I need to say something. I need you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen. When I placed that advertisement, when I asked you to come here, I thought, he stopped struggling for words. I thought I could protect you. I thought if you did not know the truth about my wealth, you would be safer. I see now how wrong I was. You lied to me, Grace said simply. I did, and I am sorry. You deserved honesty from the beginning. You deserved to make an informed choice about coming here. He met her eyes. I cannot undo what I did, but I want you to know that everything I said about needing someone real, someone genuine, that was true. And what you did today, standing up for the truth, even when it put you in danger, that was braver than anything I have ever done. I am not brave, Grace said. I am just stubborn. You are both. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. But thank you, and Grace, I am sorry about my aunt. I know she was family, and this must be difficult. She confessed to murder, Grace said flatly. She killed an innocent woman and would have let me walk into the same danger. I cannot forgive that. I do not know if I ever will. Benjamin nodded slowly. I understand, but I am sorry for Sarah. She did not deserve any of this. No, Grace agreed, she did not. Benjamin reached out as if to touch her hand, then stopped, his arm falling back to his side. I know this is not what you signed up for. You came here expecting a simple life with a farmer. Instead, you got conspiracy murder and a trial that could destroy what is left of my family. If you want to leave, if you want to take the money I owe you and go back east, I would not blame you. Grace considered the offer. She could leave, take whatever money Benjamin gave her, get on a train, start over somewhere else, put all of this behind her and never look back. But then she thought about Elizabeth Warren lying in that well for 3 years, thought about the families who had been terrorized and driven from their land, thought about Sarah sleeping in the room behind her, dealing with the consequences of choices she had never made. I am staying, she said firmly. I gave Agent Hayes my word that I would testify, and I will. Elizabeth deserves justice. Those families deserve justice, and I deserve to see this through to the end. Benjamin's relief was visible. Then I will make you a promise in return. When this is over, when the trial is finished, I am going to sell the estate. I am going to divide the money among the descendants of the families my grandfather hurt. I am going to spend the rest of my life making restitution for what my family did." "That is a good start," Grace said. "It will never be enough. It can never be enough. But it is all I can do." He started to leave, then turned back. "Grace, there is one more thing." "What?" "Lock your door tonight, and if you hear anything unusual, come get me immediately. I am staying at the hotel, but I have arranged for federal marshals to guard this building. You should be safe, but—" He trailed off, the unspoken warning hanging in the air. Grace nodded. After he left, she returned to the room and checked the lock twice. Then she sat by the window watching the street below, thinking about everything that had happened and everything that was yet to come. The attack. The attack came at 2 in the morning. Grace woke to the sound of breaking glass downstairs. Her hand flew to her throat as her heart began to race. Beside her, Sarah remained asleep, exhausted by grief and tears. Grace grabbed the fireplace poker from beside the small stove and crept to the door. She could hear voices below. Men's voices, speaking in low, urgent tones. "Find the girl. Carson wants her quiet before she can testify." Carson, the railroad man who had threatened them, who had been working with Drake, who had known about Elizabeth. Grace's grip tightened on the poker. She backed up the stairs silently, but a floorboard creaked beneath her weight. The sound seemed to echo like a gunshot in the quiet house. "There!" One of the men started up the stairs. Grace did not think. She swung the poker with all her strength, connecting with the man's shoulder as he reached the top step. He cried out and fell backward, crashing into the man behind him. Both went tumbling down the stairs in a tangle of limbs. But there was a third man. He charged up after his companions, and Grace saw the glint of a knife in his hand. She backed toward the bedroom, poker raised. The man was bigger, stronger, and he had a blade. But Grace had spent her entire life fighting to survive. She was not going to stop now. The man lunged. Grace dodged and swung again, but he caught the poker with his free hand. They struggled, Grace using every ounce of her strength to keep the knife away from her throat. Sarah woke with a scream. "Police!" Mrs. Chen's voice rang out from below, along with the distinctive sound of a shotgun being cocked. "I call police!" The other boarders, the miners, came running. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs. The man fighting Grace hesitated, and that moment of distraction was all Grace needed. She brought her knee up hard into his stomach. As he doubled over, one of the miners tackled him to the ground. The first man Grace had struck tried to flee through a window glass, shattering as he threw himself through it. The second man lay at the bottom of the stairs, groaning and clutching his arm. Sheriff Cooper arrived within minutes, responding to Mrs. Chen's alarm. The captured man refused to talk at first, but Grace had heard enough. "Carson sent them," she told Cooper. "I heard one of them say it. Carson wants me quiet before I can testify." The captured man's eyes widened with fear, realizing his mistake. Crawford, who arrived shortly after Cooper, smiled grimly. "Attempted murder of a federal witness," he said. "Oh, that is a capital offense. Carson just made his situation much worse." He turned to Grace, who was shaking but standing tall. "You all right, miss?" "I am fine." Grace's voice was steady despite her trembling hands. "But I want guards posted. 2 men at least. Because the next time someone tries to kill me, I want to make sure they do not succeed." Crawford nodded approvingly. "You have got spine, Miss Morgan. Elizabeth would have liked you." By morning, 2 federal marshals were stationed outside the boarding house. Grace and Sarah were under protective custody, and word had gone out across the territory that Samuel Carson was wanted for conspiracy to commit murder. The hunt was on. 70 years later, Benjamin paused in his telling. The night had grown full dark now, stars emerging one by one in the vast Montana sky. Thomas sat forward in his chair, completely absorbed. "She fought them off," the boy said, awe in his voice. "Alone." "She did," Benjamin said, pride evident even after all these years. "That was the night I realized Grace Morgan was not a victim who needed saving. She was a warrior, and she was fighting for something bigger than herself, for justice, for truth, for the memory of a woman she had never met, but whose death demanded answers." He looked at his grandson. "When you are overseas and you see injustice, when you watch powerful men do terrible things, and remember, Grace, remember that one person standing up for what is right can change everything." The trial 6 weeks passed. Elizabeth Warren was laid to rest in a cemetery outside Helena, A proper burial, at last, after 3 years in the dark. Her family came from Philadelphia, hollow-eyed with grief and rage, demanding justice. Grace spent those weeks preparing. Formal statements to stenographers. Hours with Hayes reviewing evidence. Learning to testify under hostile cross-examination. Building a case that would be impossible to deny. Sarah slowly began to heal. The nightmares came less frequently. She enrolled in the territorial school, making friends with other girls her age. She began to imagine a future beyond her mother's crimes. Benjamin worked tirelessly, meeting with descendants of displaced families, organizing restitution, selling off assets. He moved into a modest apartment in Helena and took a job as a clerk in a shipping office. The wealthy landowner became a working man, and somehow the change seemed to suit him. And then in late October, the trial began. The territorial courthouse was packed. Every seat filled, people standing 3 deep along the walls. It seemed like half of Helena had turned out to witness what the newspapers were calling the trial of the century. Grace and Sarah entered together. Sarah had insisted on attending, despite Benjamin's attempts to convince her to stay away. "She is my mother," the girl had said quietly. "I need to see this through." People stared, some with curiosity, some with sympathy, many with hostility. The Thorne family had been powerful in this territory for 40 years. Not everyone was happy to see that power challenged. Catherine sat at the defense table, flanked by 2 expensive lawyers brought in from San Francisco. She looked smaller than Grace remembered, diminished somehow, though she still held herself with rigid dignity. When her eyes met Grace's, there was no recognition in them, no acknowledgement, as if Grace were simply another spectator, not the woman who had helped expose her crimes. Drake sat at a separate table with his own attorney. He had negotiated his deal. Full testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence. He would not face murder charges, but he would spend 12 years in prison for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. Judge Whitmore entered, stern-faced, appointed by the territorial governor specifically for this case. The local judge had recused himself, citing his long relationship with the Thorne family. That alone told Grace how deep the corruption ran. "The territory of Montana versus Catherine Thorne," the clerk announced. "The defendant is charged with murder in the first degree in the death of Elizabeth Warren, a federal agent of the United States government." The prosecution laid out their case methodically. The hidden documents proving Jonathan Thorne's crimes. The evidence that Catherine had discovered Elizabeth's true identity. Drake's testimony about helping hide the body. The medical examiner's report on the broken neck, consistent with a fall from great height. On the 4th day, Grace was called to testify. She walked to the witness stand on legs that felt steadier than they had any right to be. She had been terrified back in Boston of so many things. Poverty, loneliness, a future without hope. But she was not terrified anymore. Somewhere between stepping off that train and standing in this courtroom, she had found something stronger than fear. She had found purpose. The prosecutor walked her through everything. Her arrival at Thorne Estate, the warning she had received, Elizabeth's note on the balcony, the confrontation at dinner, Catherine's confession in the study. Every detail spoken clearly and precisely for the record. The defense attorney tried to rattle her, tried to paint her as a gold digger who had invented the story for attention or money or revenge. But Grace did not waver. She answered each question with calm certainty, looking the lawyer directly in the eye. "Isn't it true, Miss Morgan, that you came to Montana specifically to marry into wealth?" "No, I believe Benjamin Thorne was a poor farmer. I had no idea about his family's wealth until I arrived." "Yet you stayed even after learning the truth. Why?" "What were you hoping to gain?" "Justice for Elizabeth Warren. Nothing more." "Justice?" the lawyer repeated mockingly. "How very noble. And I suppose you expect us to believe you have been living at Mr. Thorne's expense for the past 6 weeks out of the goodness of your heart." Hayes stood. "Objection. Miss Morgan's living arrangements are irrelevant to whether Mrs. Thorne murdered a federal agent." "Sustained," Judge Whitmore said sharply. "Mr. Dalton, confine your questions to matters pertaining to this case." The defense did their damage where they could. Grace saw doubt flicker in the eyes of some jurors, suspicion that maybe she was lying for personal gain. But then other witnesses testified. Ranch hands who had heard Catherine and Drake arguing the night Elizabeth disappeared. The telegraph operator's widow who described her husband's fear in the days before his death. The federal surveyor who confirmed the fraud in the land transfers. The medical examiner who presented Elizabeth's remains and explained the injuries. and Drake himself describing in detail how Catherine had come to him in the night, how they had hidden the body, how they had created the fiction of Elizabeth running away. "I am not proud of what I did," Drake said, his voice breaking. "I let fear and greed turn me into a criminal. I helped cover up a murder. All I can do now is tell the truth and accept the consequences." The defense tried to discredit him, but his testimony was too detailed, too consistent with the physical evidence, too damning. Then Catherine took the stand. Against her lawyer's advice, she insisted on testifying, and she sealed her own fate. "I did what any mother would do," she said, her voice cold and defiant. "Elizabeth Warren was a threat to my family. She was going to destroy everything we had built, ruin my daughter's future. I confronted her, told her to leave. She refused. She said she had a duty to expose us, that justice demanded it." Catherine's eyes were hard as stone. "So I pushed her. I pushed her off that balcony, and I would do it again to protect Sarah." The courtroom erupted. Judge Whitmore banged his gavel repeatedly to restore order. Sarah, sitting beside Grace, buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Catherine's lawyers immediately moved for a recess, probably to berate their client for her confession. But the damage was catastrophic. Catherine Thorne had just admitted to premeditated murder in front of a packed courtroom full of witnesses and newspaper reporters. There was no taking it back. The defense tried to argue temporary insanity, tried to paint Catherine as a desperate woman driven to madness by the threat to her family. But the prosecution destroyed that argument easily. Catherine's calm demeanor, her careful planning with Drake, the cover-up that had lasted 3 years. None of it suggested a moment of temporary madness. This was calculated murder. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Catherine showed no emotion as the verdict was read. She stood rigid, unyielding, carved from ice. But Sarah wept openly, and Benjamin sat with his head bowed, shoulders shaking. 3 days later came the sentencing. Judge Whitmore looked down at Catherine with an expression of profound disappointment. "Mrs. Thorne, you have been convicted of murdering a federal agent engaged in the lawful performance of her duties. This is among the most serious crimes that can be committed in this territory. Your actions have brought shame upon your family, endangered other innocent people, and obstructed justice for 3 years. You have shown no remorse, no understanding of the gravity of your crimes." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "It is the judgment of this court that you be imprisoned for the remainder of your natural life without possibility of parole. You will be transferred to the territorial prison at Deer Lodge, where you will serve your sentence. May you find in that time some understanding of what you have done and some measure of redemption." Catherine was led away in chains. She did not look back at Sarah, did not acknowledge her daughter's anguished cries. She simply walked out of the courtroom with her head high, as if she were leaving a social engagement rather than beginning a life sentence. Drake was sentenced the following week to 12 years in prison. His cooperation had earned him leniency, but Judge Whitmore made clear that helping cover up a murder still demanded serious punishment 70 years later. Benjamin's voice had grown rough with emotion. Thomas could see tears tracking down his grandfather's weathered cheeks. "She went to prison," Thomas said softly. "Your aunt, she spent the rest of her life there." "She did. Died there 10 years later. Never showed a moment of regret for what she had done." Benjamin shook his head. "That was when I learned that blood does not make family. Love makes family. Trust makes family. Catherine shared my blood, but she was never truly family. Not the way Grace became family." He looked at his grandson. "Grace, who had every reason to run, stayed and fought for justice. That is family. That is what matters." The trial's aftermath rippled through the territory like an earthquake. 3 territorial officials resigned when their connections to Thorne land schemes were exposed. 2 judges were removed from the bench. A congressman lost his seat when documents showed he had received illegal payments from Jonathan Thorne decades earlier. And Samuel Carson, who had been captured trying to flee to Canada, was brought back to face charges for the murder of the telegraph operator and the attempted murder of Grace. His trial began in December. Grace testified again this time about Carson's threats, his obvious knowledge of Elizabeth's fate, his attempted murder, when he sent men to silence her before she could testify. Carson was convicted in January and sentenced to hang. The execution was scheduled for March. Grace refused to attend. She had seen enough death, enough violence, enough of what hate and greed could do to people. Benjamin kept his promise. In February, he formally transferred ownership of Thorne Estate to a trust managed by Hayes and several federal officials. The land was sold in parcels. The proceeds were divided among the descendants of the families who had been forced out. It took months to track down all the families to verify their claims to calculate fair compensation. Some descendants did not want the money. It felt like blood money to them, tainted by the violence that had made it possible. Others accepted gratefully, seeing it as partial justice for wrongs that had never been addressed. The Henderson family received the largest settlement. They used it to buy back part of their ancestral land and rebuild the farm their great-grandparents had lost. Benjamin kept almost nothing for himself. He sold his personal possessions, lived in his modest apartment, worked his clerk's job. The wealthy landowner had become a working man, and the change seemed to bring him a peace he had never known before. Grace's work with the prosecutor's office continued. Hayes became her mentor, teaching her investigative techniques, introducing her to other women who worked in unconventional fields. "You are good at this," Hayes told her one afternoon. "You have an eye for detail, and people trust you. Have you ever thought about becoming an investigator yourself?" "Women cannot be federal investigators," Grace said. "Not yet," Hayes replied with a smile. "But that will change. Everything changes eventually. When the rules finally do change, you will be ready." Hayes invited Grace to a women's suffrage meeting. Grace went more out of curiosity than conviction. But as she listened to women talk about their right to vote, their right to own property without a husband's permission, their right to work in any profession they chose, something stirred in her chest. These were the things she had been fighting for without realizing it. Every time she had stood up to Catherine Thorne, every time she had refused to be intimidated or silenced, every time she had insisted on the truth, even when it was dangerous. She had been fighting for the right to be treated as a full person, not as property or a decoration or a problem to be managed. She started attending more meetings, reading the suffrage newspapers, connecting with other women who were tired of being told their place was in the home and nowhere else. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. This sense of being part of something larger than herself, something that could actually change the world. Summer came to Montana hot and dry. The territorial governor ordered a full investigation into land fraud throughout the territory. Hayes was promoted to lead the investigation, and she immediately asked Grace to join her team. "It will mean travel," Hayes warned, "sometimes to remote areas, sometimes for weeks at a time. Hard work, and not everyone will be happy to see us. But Grace, we are going to clean up this territory. We are going to make sure what happened with the Thorne estate cannot happen again." "When do we start?" Grace asked. They started in June, traveling from town to town, interviewing families who had been forced off their land, examining old property records, building cases against men who had thought themselves untouchable. Some of the men were powerful with connections to territorial officials. Some were dangerous. Grace received more than one threat, but she persisted, driven by the memory of Elizabeth Warren and the knowledge that someone had to stand up to the corruption that had infected this territory for decades. By autumn, they had built cases against 17 landowners and 12 territorial officials. The trials would take years, but the message was clear. The old ways were ending. The territory was changing. People who had built fortunes on violence and fraud would be held accountable. In September, Sarah started at the Territorial Normal School, training to become a teacher. She had grown taller over the summer, and some of the shadows had lifted from her eyes. She would never fully heal from the trauma of her mother's crimes, but she was learning to live with it, to build an identity separate from Catherine Thorne's legacy. "I am going to use my mother's name," she told Grace one evening, "not to honor her, to remind myself where I came from, to remember that I have a choice about who I become. And that choice matters more than blood." Grace felt pride swell in her chest. Sarah was going to be all right, different than she would have been, marked by pain and loss, but strong, resilient, her own person. The departure. One evening in late September, Benjamin appeared at the boarding house with an envelope in his hand. Inside were documents, a deed to a small house on the edge of Helena, a bank book showing a modest account in Grace's name. "What is this?" Grace asked, confused. "The house belonged to my grandmother," Benjamin said. "It is small, but it is sound. And the account, that is what remains of my personal inheritance after I settled all the debts and restitution. It is not much, but it is enough to live on modestly if you are careful. Benjamin, I cannot accept this. Please, his voice was intense, urgent. Please let me do this. You gave up everything to testify, to make sure justice was done. You took care of Sarah when she had no one else. You have been working for less money than you deserve because you wanted to help clean up the mess my family made. Let me do this much at least. Grace looked down at the documents in her hands. A house, financial security, the independence she had always dreamed of but never thought she would achieve. Why, shall? She asked softly. Because I cannot undo what my family did, cannot bring Elizabeth back, cannot erase the pain we caused. But I can make sure that you, the woman who had the courage to stand up when everyone else was looking away, have a secure future. He paused. And because I am leaving, heading to California, there is nothing left for me here. What will you do there? I do not know. Find work. Start over. Be someone who is not defined by his family's crimes. He smiled slightly. Maybe I will finally become that poor farmer I pretended to be in the advertisement. You could stay, Grace said. You have done good things here. The restitution, the cooperation with the investigation. You have helped make things right. I have helped start making things right. But I will never be able to fix what my family broke. The best thing I can do is step aside. Let Montana build something better without the Thorne name hanging over it. He pulled another envelope from his pocket. This is for Sarah, a letter explaining everything, why I have to leave, why I think it is better this way, how proud I am of the woman she is becoming. Will you give it to her? Grace took the letter, though she thought he was wrong. Sarah would want to say goodbye, would want the chance to thank him for the trust he had set up for her education. But she understood that Benjamin needed to do this his way, needed to believe he was protecting Sarah one last time. Grace Morgan, he said, looking at her with eyes that held profound respect. You are the bravest person I have ever met. You came to Montana with nothing, and you have built something remarkable. Elizabeth would have liked you, I think, would have been proud to know you finished what she started. I did not finish anything, Grace said. I just helped. You did more than help. You changed this territory. You stood up when you had every reason to run away, and you made sure justice was done. That is not nothing. That is everything. He tipped his hat to her one final time and walked away. Grace watched him disappear down the street, this man she had almost married, whose family had shaped her destiny in ways she could never have imagined. She hoped he would find peace in California, hoped he would build the honest life he had once pretended to offer her, hoped he would eventually forgive himself for the sins he had inherited but not committed 70 years later. Benjamin's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. The night was full dark now, Montana spreading vast and silent around them. You never saw her again? Thomas asked. Oh, I saw her. Benjamin smiled through his tears. Over the years, at a distance, she became one of the most respected investigators in the territory. When Montana became a state in '89, they hired her officially. She worked into her 70s, tracking down fraud and corruption, making sure no one else could build an empire on blood. Did you ever tell her you loved her? Benjamin was quiet for a long moment. I did not deserve to love her, boy. I had lied to her, put her in danger. By the time I understood what she meant to me, she had moved beyond needing anything from me. She had become something greater than any future I could have offered. He looked at his grandson. That is another lesson. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone go. Let them become who they are meant to be without you holding them back. Now, Benjamin said, straightening in his chair, despite his age, let me tell you how the story ended. 1 year later, October 1885, the first snow of the season dusted the mountains, and Grace stood in her garden watching the flakes drift down from a vast sky. She had been in Montana for over a year. A year ago, she had stepped off a train expecting to marry a poor farmer and live a simple, quiet life. Instead, she had helped solve a murder, exposed territorial corruption, built a career investigating land fraud. She owned a house, had money in the bank, had meaningful work and genuine friends. She had testified in trials that made national news, had faced down powerful men who tried to intimidate her, had proven to herself and everyone else that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. She had come to Montana seeking security. She had found strength instead. Ogden Hayes arrived in her government wagon, papers in hand, eyes bright with determination. "I have got 3 new cases for us," she said. "Landowners in the eastern part of the territory. Same pattern as Thorne Estate. Intimidation, fraud, possibly murder. Think you are up for another investigation?" Grace looked at the papers, then at the snow falling gently on her garden, then back at Hayes's expectant face. A year ago, she would have been terrified. A year ago, she would have looked for an escape, a way to avoid danger and difficulty. But that woman was gone. That woman had been burned away in the fires of scandal, in trial and testimony. Someone new had emerged, someone who understood that safety was not the same as living, that security meant nothing if you had to compromise your integrity to achieve it. "I am up for it," Grace said confidently. "When do we leave?" "Day after tomorrow. Pack warm. We will be in the mountains." Hayes left to prepare for the journey, and Grace went inside to get ready. She packed efficiently, having learned over the past year exactly what she would need for an investigation. Warm clothes, sturdy boots, notebooks, pencils. The tools of her new trade. Sarah stopped by that evening, excited about her studies at the normal school. "We are learning about educational theory," she said, spreading text across Grace's kitchen table. "About how children learn best, how to create effective lesson plans. It is fascinating." "You will be a wonderful teacher," Grace said, and she meant it. The girl had transformed over the past year, growing from a frightened child into a confident young woman who knew her own mind, who was making her own choices, building her own future. 2 days later, Grace climbed into Hayes's wagon and headed east toward the mountains, toward new investigations, new challenges, new dangers and discoveries that lay ahead. The sun rose over the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The air was cold and clean. The whole territory seemed to shimmer with possibility. Grace smiled. For the first time in her life, she was not running from something. She was running toward it. Toward truth. Toward justice. Toward the future she had chosen for herself. The mail-order bride was gone. In her place was a woman who belonged to no one but herself. Montana, March 1954. Benjamin finished his story as the stars wheeled overhead. Thomas sat in silence, processing everything he had heard. "So that is why we have nothing," the boy finally said. "Why you sold everything." "We have more than nothing," Benjamin corrected gently. "We have honor. We have a clean conscience. We have the knowledge that we tried to make right what was wrong." He tapped the photograph of Grace. "This is what matters, not land or money or power, but the choices we make, the stand we take, the legacy we leave in people's hearts." Thomas stood preparing to leave in the morning for war. Benjamin rose too, moving stiffly, and pulled his grandson into an embrace. "Remember what I have taught you," the old man said. "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing what is right even when everything inside you screams to run. Grace Morgan taught me that. Now I am teaching you." He handed Thomas an envelope. "There is $500 inside. Money I saved from my work, not Thorne money, money earned honestly. Keep it safe. Use it when you need it, and remember that wealth means nothing if your soul is corrupt." Thomas took the envelope, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you, grandfather." "Go with honor, boy. Fight with courage. Come home to us." Thomas left, walking into the darkness toward his future. Benjamin watched him go, then sank back into his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 80 years. But as he sat there in the Montana night holding that old photograph, he did not feel regret. He felt peace. He had told the truth, had taught his grandson the lessons that mattered, had honored the memory of the woman who had saved him by showing him what true courage looked like. Grace Morgan was still out there somewhere, 70 years old now and still investigating fraud, still fighting for justice, still teaching people that doing right mattered more than being comfortable. And every time Benjamin looked at these mountains, he remembered, not what he had lost, but what she had taught him. That legacy is not what you leave behind. It is what you leave in hearts, in changed lives, in a world made better because you stood up when you could have stayed silent. The mail-order bride who became a warrior, the woman who changed a territory, the person who proved that one voice speaking truth to power could bring down empires. Benjamin closed his eyes and smiled. That was a story worth telling, a life worth remembering, a legacy worth protecting. And somewhere in the Montana night, he could almost hear Grace's voice, strong and clear and certain, saying what she had always said. The truth matters. Justice matters. And courage, real courage, means standing up even when you are afraid, especially when you are afraid.